Here is good, the corner of Delaware. They were beside a large industrial building in the south of the city. They stretched themselves out after the cab ride. The streets were quiet. This was a meat warehouse. Christian filled his friends in on the setting for the event they were about to see. A suitable grotesque. Brick with corrugated siding above, the complex occupied a city block. Fortunately for us, it's no longer functioning. Christian slapped Dan on the back. Now it only stands as an empty, morbid symbol of what it was. It's a club sometimes. They use the space as a club, a gay club. I've been here before, Alan remembered. Yeah, the Abattoir. A gay club called the Abattoir? Dan shook his head. It was dark now, and the suburban sky was an unusual black. Dan was reminded of the nighttime streets of Milwaukee. Big, gay clubs were always in the sticks. A fine illustration of the way some homos still embrace their persecution. You're the one in bondage pants, Alan reminded Christian. So what's this got to do with the performance we're seeing? Mildred and Mordred? It's not difficult. Yeah, that's my problem with it. Alan prefers something more obscure. Conceptual art should be about something other than the material it shows, Alan stated. You should let concepts rest. They are what they are. Alan moved behind Dan and held him round the waist. He mock-whispered in his ear, In art, the best thing is not to even mention the fact that what you're doing is a metaphor. Please take note. Dan gave no resistance to Alan's slow seesawing behind him. And now what you're doing is not a metaphor at all, but the very thing itself, like I said, the theatre impresario pointed out. Christian gets jealous. Don't mind him. I'm sure you two are in a book, Dan said. He felt horny beneath the featureless sky, against the blank faces of empty buildings, amongst the nondescript corridors of warehousing industry, with Alan pushing behind him, solid and reassuring. I don't get jealous because I never consider alternatives. I agree. The simplest objects are the best ones. You should grab them. Take your own advice. Alan deliberately nuzzled Dan. And grab them while you can. The present is what slips away, while you go after bigger fish to fry. Alan already has his interpretations, please excuse him. But interpretations... Christian tapped Alan on the head with some sort of stick he quickly drew from his cloak. What the... It was some kind of cane, a wand. Your own presumption means you're listening only to yourself, whack. Merely confirming what you, whack, already don't know, whack. Strangely, Dan noticed, Christian's thudding insistence was taken up by Alan, passing down from Alan's head to modulate the rhythm with which his hips were pushing toward Dan. Your holding on to your interpretation already takes you away from the thing itself. The impresario drew up the wings of his cloak. It billowed temporarily and then settled back down. Christian's green eyes sparkled in the halogen flood of the lot across the street. If you hold your tongue, you might find the thing itself, the actual thing, where we actually are. This was an abattoir, and now it isn't. That is all we can say for sure. Dan and Alan looked at Christian. Christian looked at them. Stop spooning and move along. Their host led them down the absent sidewalk. Security lights of adjacent lots switched on and off as the men moved beneath the brick and corrugated wall. A billboard advertised the building as vacant and available for temporary hire. The phone number had the old city code. In the distance, cars were parking. Glamorous people were getting out and disappearing into the wall. The things we do for art, Alan said. Christian marched on, his cloak flapping in his own breeze. I wanted to give you an idea of the size of the place, he said. An old fire exit opened its dark rectangle onto the road. Above the doorway, blue neon scrolled over a curtain of purple velvet. Mordred Vienna, it read in Gothic script. One night only. Posters bracketed the doorway. A woman's face looked out from them, glossy through lamination. There were medical implements around the face, laid out in patterns evoking some esoteric hieroglyphs. Dan didn't know how to read these arrangements, but they were evocative of mysticism and cabals. Or was it simply about plastic surgery and the pressures on women to alter their appearance? Collecting tickets and directing the queue into the belly of the abattoir was a woman Christian knew. He embraced her briefly and kissed her cheeks. She was a broad-shouldered woman in a long grey dress over auburn skin. She had hazel eyes, and her hair was closely cropped. "This is Mildred. Mildred? Some new friends. Dan? Alan." "I'm Mordred's other half," Mildred greeted, reaching out as if she were going to take their hands, but then just drifting her long fingers across their chests in turn, lightly touching them. When Mordred's unable to greet people herself, Mildred comes. "Mordred and I are the same person," said Mildred. "In meeting me, you meet Mordred also. Please relate to me as you would to her." "And be sure you do," advised Christian, "because your behavior toward each one of them has repercussions for the other. We're just like people." Mildred donated an ethereal smile. Dan supposed this must be part of the performance. This was one of those total theatre events. His life was becoming one of those. Anyhow, Mildred was very elegant at it. She seemed to truly live in the attitudes she assumed. She generated a palpable atmosphere, and an inhabited grace issued through the turning of her wrist. Christian was searching for something in the lining of his cloak. Other theatre-goers were stacking up at the roadside. Mildred touched Christian to draw his attention. "No need. There are others behind you. We will have a conversation later." She ushered them through the doorway. Inside the building, things were cavernous and cold. It was refrigerated. Dry ice crept along the floor, rose up the walls to the ceiling, and then fell back down in convection arcs and ragged waves. Cloud banks spiraled up their legs and wrapped around their waists as they entered. Red and blue lights made purple shadows in the fog. The audience were handed artificial furs. "Is this Alaska?" whispered Alan. "Uh-huh, and the Aurora Borealis," said Dan. A soundtrack played through the warehouse. "This music is immersive," Christian noted, wrapping his fur over his cloak. Sound pirouetted and swelled in long repeated loops. It promised forward movement, but then fell back and levelled like the mist. Echoes clottered in the fog. "I think we're supposed to follow this." Alan had noticed a silver trail on the floor, briefly visible as the fog divided with their wading through it. They moved deeper into the building. The track on the warehouse floor was echoed by rails in the roof above. Some rails shone more luminously than others, bright spores paralleling the path to be followed. The audience was shepherded to a cube of stacked seating. Chicken wire cells, each containing 3 seats, were stacked one above the other, 6 stories high around the edge of a square. This was the performance space. Other spectators were obediently following the branching spores and taking their allotted seats. Christian found their tickets. Stack D, Level A, Cage 3, 7, 8, and 9. They made their way to the far side of the cube. A was the top level. They climbed up scaffolding behind the cages and unlocked the door to their cell. "This is cozy," said Alan. They clambered in. Christian locked the door behind them. The invitation card had carried a key. Dan sat in the middle seat. "Excellent," said Christian. He surveyed the installation. He mentally congratulated Mildred and Mordred on the novelty of the layout and thanked them for the seats. It was one night only. Tickets were $100. He did some math. 4 stacks of seating, 6 cells high, 6 cells wide, 3 seats to a cell, $43,200. A good view, said Alan, rubbing his hands together and blowing on them. He then decided to warm them between Dan's thighs. He pushed his hands into the crevice. Hand warmer, he explained. Christian, hand warmer, he offered. I'm not sure Dan is completely comfortable with you offering him round as a hand warmer. You've been watching too much PBS, said Alan. You're beginning to sound like Oscar Wilde. 4 hands wouldn't fit anyhow, Dan excused himself. Alan looked Scandinavian handsome, with the bulk of his fox fur around his neck. He's a one-guy guy, I guess, the Viking apologized with a grin. All the more reason for you not to pass him around like a bucket of popcorn. A lighting gantry stretched out ahead of them, just above their height. The rig was slung from the rafters, suspended high above the performance area. A block of lemon-yellow light poured down and held its edges against the swirling meringue of blue in the areas beyond. Christian appraised the lights on the rig. Argon cans, barns nice and straight, even in all this murk. Christian's surveying days had been useful. The mindset helped him with technical appreciation and orientation. Dracula knows something about lighting. He knows all the words. I feel like a battery hen looking at a fish tank, Dan offered. His eyes searched the rows of the audience opposite. Since Alan had been pressing against him, Dan's brain had become pretty vacant, or full, maybe full and thoughtless simultaneously. Nothing specific kicked off in the warm fog inside. He let Alan press and fondle. He never thought when someone was touching him. Touch was the opposite of thinking. Hey, Shady listeners, I'm going to have to interrupt my storytelling there. That was an excerpt from my novel The Queer Diary of Mordred Vienna by me, Russell Christie. I may read further excerpts in the future, but if in the meantime you'd like more, and to find out exactly what the performance is that Mildred and Mordred are about to enact, the novel is available from Five Leaves Bookshop, Ideas on Paper, or Rough Trade in the city, or online from the corporate monster of Amazon. E-versions are available. Until next time then, that's me signing off from the Aquaricon. Enjoy the rest of the Shady Radio show.